So I wanted to catch everybody up on some things that I've been researching and kind of where I'm at with my mind as far as how we could possibly fix our situation in our country. We've kind of covered income taxes and put that thing to bed, that none of us are supposed to be paying income taxes, and it's all a big scam. And so my next thing was looking into property taxes, because as everyone knows across the entire country, the counties have gone absolutely insane with raising everybody's taxes, raising everybody's property values. And it's getting to the point where you don't really own your property. You actually, it's more like renting the property from the county, because they could just continue to raise the rates until you can no longer afford it. So if you think about someone like my mom and dad, they're retired. They have no income coming in other than their retirement. So they're on a fixed income. And at some point, the county is going to reach a level where they can no longer afford the taxes on their property. And so what they've worked for their entire life is basically for nothing, because they're going to end up losing it and end up having to, move into God knows where, because they're not going to be able to afford the taxes to own the things that they own. And then you get into the, even crazier, if your parents wanted to leave you their property, then you're going to end up having to pay the taxes on these properties, and you may or may not be able to afford them yourself. And so you end up losing something that your family or your parents had worked for their entire lives, and now the government gets it for free. And so it seems completely unreal. It seems completely illegal. And so one of the things that I've been researching in some pretty great depth is whether or not this stuff is legit. Is it true that we can lose all of our property? Is it true that the county actually has the ability to tax our property? Do they have the ability to take the property if you don't pay the tax? And so for the last couple of years, I've been researching this, and I've been experimenting with this, trying to determine whether or not this stuff is true, how much power does the county have, and what can we do about it. And I've come to a few conclusions. Number one, if you go to the county meetings and stand up in front of the board and argue with them about whether or not they have the power to do this, that, and the other, that is a complete and utter waste of time. These people are oblivious to what your rights are. They don't know what the Constitution says, and they have no idea, and they don't care. That it's kind of weird how you are a citizen, but you get into this position of power and you all of a sudden stop caring about your neighbors. It becomes a matter of power at that point, and it's crazy. And so it causes you to immediately step back and think, well, we must not have constitutional rights. These people are taking advantage of us. We don't have the ability to do anything about it. The law enforcement is behind them. The sheriff will come with the county to take your property and kick you off of it. And so there's a lot of things going on that just don't make any sense. And so the conversations are just not going to help. They're not going to happen. One of the things that I did when I started researching this stuff is I started sending notices to the county, and the essential part of the notice was asking the county to provide the legal basis. What law are you actually following when you come tax my property, or when you reevaluate the property? What law are you following in order to do that? And what I essentially got from them was nothing. And so that kind of led me down this First Amendment thing. You have a right to redress a grievance in the First Amendment, but when you ask the government for something, to explain what they're doing, and they refuse to even answer your question, well, that's to me, that's a violation of your First Amendment rights. They should have to at least address what it is you have a problem with and explain to you where they're getting the power, or how they're getting the power, and how it works. But these government officials just ignore you. They don't want anything to do with it. They don't have any answers for you. They just do what they do. do, and that's the end of the conversation. Who are you, lowly Glenn, to come in and challenge their power? And so this has led down a massive road of research. I have done just an incredible amount of research. I've spent a lot of time learning how the Constitution works, how everything is set up. And so in this video, I wanted to kind of go through where I'm at and what all of us need to actually get into doing. The first thing that I want to mention is that I don't believe you're going to fix this by any conversations with the politicians or with any of your city council, the county commissioners. I don't think you're going to fix it that way. And the reason is, like I said, they ignore you. I'll give you an example. I sent a letter to the county tax commissioner in one of the counties that I own property in, and I asked them to supply me the law that actually is giving them all this power. And their attorney responded back to me and basically said that if you don't believe you have to pay taxes, don't pay them and find out and see what happens. And that wasn't an answer to any of my questions. That was a threat. And so what I ended up deciding to do is to sue the county. I sued the attorney that wrote that letter. I sued the county commissioners, and I sued the county tax commissioner. Right now, I am in Superior Court in Georgia, challenging these laws, and I'm going to show you exactly how bad it is here in Georgia. And I challenge you, if you're in a different state, to actually go research your tax laws, because you may be in a similar situation. This court case, it's been going on since August, so a few months. The defense has been filing motion after motion after motion, trying to get this thing dismissed. And we kind of probably should, have some courses on how to deal with the court system. How do you file your complaint? What kind of things are going to come back? How are they going to try to get around it? And essentially right now, all they're doing is trying to make fun of me because I'm pro se, which is another thing. I don't believe we're going to hire attorneys to do this for us. The attorneys are all strapped down through the Bar Association, which is another court case that I'm about to file. But the Bar Association kind of keeps them all hamstrung, where they can't get too far out of line, or they run the risk of losing their license. Plus, I've never met an attorney that knows anything about what I'm going to say. And so I'll give you an example of how bad the attorneys are. I ran into a supposed constitutional attorney who made the claim that the supremacy clause, or he made the claim that the Bill of Rights don't apply to the states. And I never could understand what he was talking about. It's illogical. What do you mean the Bill of Rights don't apply to the states? And so I started researching this, and I ran across a case called Barron versus Baltimore. This was the case that caused all of the attorneys and all of the people to come up with this idea that the Bill of Rights don't apply to the states. It is the most nonsensical case I've ever seen. I mean, I've seen some pretty stupid Supreme Court cases, but this one took the case. And actually, there's one dumber. But I'm sitting there and I'm trying to figure out exactly how this stuff is working. And in Barron, what they ruled is that in the First Amendment, it says the Senate, I think it says the Congress shall not pass any law that infringes upon, and it goes through a list. Well, this judge took that to mean that it was only talking about the federal Senate. It wasn't talking about the states, and therefore the states didn't have to pay any attention to the Bill of Rights. But the problem that this judge and everybody since then, because that was in 1833 when that was done, all the way up until after the Civil War, when we got the 14th Amendment, which is the second stupidest thing I've ever seen a judge say. All the way up to that point, all of them just started acting like, well, the states don't have to pay any attention to the Bill of Rights. But the interesting thing about this is that the very first Supreme Court case that ever got passed was Jiminy Christmas, I forgot. Chisholm versus Georgia. And in Chisholm versus Georgia, the judge spent a tremendous amount of time talking about sovereignty. And in this case, he basically ruled that states don't have sovereignty over their citizens. They actually get their sovereignty from the citizens. And literally 1 year after that case went through, the Congress passed a Bill of Rights, the 11th Amendment, which basically says that a citizen from another state can't sue a different state, and a person from a foreign country can't sue a state. And so the judges then immediately said, well, you can't sue the states are sovereign, and you can't sue them any longer. That you have to get permission from the state to be able to sue them. But the one thing that's missing from the 11th Amendment that is very suspicious is it doesn't say the citizens of a state can't sue their own state. And yet, even today, in 2025, the state still claims sovereignty over their own citizens, and it's something that just baffles my mind. I don't understand how they do this, and I am of the opinion that they can't do this. That we need to correct this, but we're not going to correct it going to a meeting and having a discussion with them. But anyway, this is where it gets even dumber. So I've always wondered why almost every single case that you see, they're arguing through the 14th Amendment, 1983, 1983 code section. And I finally, once I found Baltimore, or, you know, the Baltimore case, the Barron case, I then started researching, well, where in the world did this come from? Like, how is it that the 14th Amendment even has any bearing on the states? In fact, how is it that the 11th Amendment that had this state sovereignty crap come up, how did it have any bearing on the states? None of it made any sense. These people are still paying attention to the Bill of Rights on some level, but then they pretend the states don't have to pay attention to it. So then the states go and pass their own Bill of Rights and they do all this other stuff. And so it essentially, with the 14th Amendment in 1925, another idiot judge made the ruling, and he literally used these words when he said, we must assume that the Bill of Rights are accessible through the 14th Amendment, because you have a due process clause of the 14th Amendment. And I've been arguing this whole time that the 14th Amendment, and the Supreme Court backs me up, the 14th Amendment has nothing to do with anybody that was already a citizen of the country, of a state. It only had to do with the newly freed slaves. I'm not going to get into whether current black people have all of the Bill of Rights protections that we have. That's not even my argument. But all you've got to do is go to 42 USC 1981 and 82 and notice that all the rights that they're given, all of the protections, and they call them privileges. And I'll get into this, but they call them privileges. But all of these privileges that they're giving them are the same as the white people. So obviously the 14th Amendment, which those code sections are codifying, obviously the 14th Amendment has nothing to do with white people. Absolutely nothing. And so, but here's the thing. The 14th Amendment is a privileged class of people. Now, what's the difference between a right and a privilege? Well, a right, you can't take it away from anybody. A privilege, you can take it away. So whoever made that privilege, whoever granted that privilege, has the ability to remove the privilege. Well, who did? The federal government. They passed a constitutional amendment that said that they were freeing the slaves, and that they were, any of them that were born within the jurisdiction of the federal government was considered a citizen of the United States. Well, we can get into the whole jurisdiction thing, and I've done that in other videos, but I'm not going to really dig into it now. But the point is the 14th Amendment has nothing to do with us. But why would they want us to go through 1983 to get to the Bill of Rights? And the answer is pretty simple. If you're coming at it from a privileged position and not from a right, then you don't really get the full protections of the Bill of Rights. And the courts have actually ruled in the past that none of the Bill of Rights actually apply to 14th Amendment. They don't. You can't say that a 14th Amendment citizen gets the First Amendment. They are completely different things, and that's why they had to codify what exactly privileges the 14th Amendment citizens got. So when this judge forced all of us to go through 1983 to get to any of the Bill of Rights, it was another nonsensical argument. It made no sense whatsoever. And so why is that? Why do I make this claim that almost any attorney that you go to is going to argue about? Why do I make that claim? And so let's get into this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you clearly why the property taxes are illegal, at least in Georgia. And I argue that they're illegal in every single state. And I'm going to kind of lay this out as simply as I possibly can. I wanted to show you real quick. This is a folder of all of my court case. It's again in Superior Court in Georgia. They're actually, I had to go to court and represent myself a week ago, and the judge that was over the case, I don't even really know how to talk about it. He was super nice. I feel like I did a really good job in court. I was prepared. In fact, I was more prepared than the defense attorney. But he got stuck on this privilege, this sovereignty thing, and said that I was suing the wrong people, that I don't know law. And I mean, he was kind of making fun of me, which is fine. But, he was making an argument that actually is making multiple arguments that made literally no sense whatsoever. Now, you could argue that I don't know law, and you would be correct. I'm learning this as I go, but I've studied this a lot more than I believe he has, at least in this particular area. And he's wrong. But he's saying that he's going to dismiss my case. But at the very end, he did say that he's going to go actually read my case before he dismisses it to make sure that, he doesn't have, that he's not in error. So at least we're at that point. I do not know if my case is going to get dismissed. I know for a fact that if it gets dismissed, I'm going to be appealing it because I don't believe that I am incorrect in who I'm suing. And I do believe that this judge is actually incorrect. And based on his other arguments, and I'm not going to get into them now, but based on some of his arguments, they were so nonsensical that I literally didn't even understand what he was trying to say. They were crazy. But these are all the motions that have gone on since August in my particular case. So, and the only reason I'm showing this is because it's been crazy. Like the defense is throwing everything they can trying to get this thing dismissed. And they may actually get it dismissed, but the reason is doesn't even make any sense. But it is a involved process. And the problem is that right now, we're not even at the stage of them looking at the legality of my argument. They're arguing crazy stuff like process things. You filed it in the wrong court. You filed it in the wrong place. You got the wrong people on the thing. So this part, I think, is probably the most complicated, and I'm hoping that I'm at the point that if the judge reads my last motion that I put in, forget all the rest of it. If he just reads the last motion, I feel pretty good that he's not going to dismiss the case, and we can actually get on to the actual content of the arguments. So it isn't expensive when you're representing yourself. I have about $400 in this case so far, not counting my time. Obviously, I've got to research it and I've got to write all the motions and the responses and that stuff. But I'm happy to share with anybody that wants to learn how to do this. And I'm thinking about maybe setting up a course on how to actually operate in court. But this is the process. It is something any of us can do. Some of us may be better at it than others, but it's something that we should learn how to do. You should actually learn how to represent yourself. So let's get into the content of Georgia and why this whole property tax thing is illegal. So what I've done is I've kind of drawn up a little diagram here, and we're gonna zoom in and we're gonna kind of walk through this process and see how this works. So the first thing is is that when I filed my court case, I did not go through the 14th Amendment. I specifically laid out why I was not going through it. And for anyone that is interested, I actually have a document that I wrote. Let's see if I can find it here. This attachment A is what it ended up being in this particular document. But this is actually a document that I wrote explaining why the court is in error and why Barron and Gitlow, which are the two cases that I was referring to a minute ago, why these two cases need to be overturned. They need, at the very least, they should be ignored. Because, and I laid out all the details here as to why these things are just inconsistent with what the Constitution actually says. And just to kind of think about this, if the Bill of Rights don't apply to the states, then that would indicate that the Supremacy Clause, which is the first thing we're going to cover here, doesn't have any effect on the states either. And if the Supremacy Clause doesn't have any effect on the states, then the decisions of the Supreme Court have no effect on the states. And the laws that the federal government passes have no effect on the states. Well, we know that's not true. They do it all the time. So we know that they're paying attention to the Supreme Court and that they're doing it. So the point is that Barron is so stupid that it just doesn't even make any sense. So don't file your court cases under 42-1983, no matter what your attorney says. I have not done that. I've filed supplements or attachments. I have argued why I am not doing that. And so far, I have not had any of my cases kicked out due to me not filing under the 42-1983. So that's the first thing, because what happens then is I'm actually arguing core constitutional rights. I'm not going through a privileged class to try to get there. I'm starting out right where I want to be. And so what is the Supremacy Clause? The Supremacy Clause says this Constitution is talking about the federal Constitution and the laws of the United States. And this is important. The laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof. In other words, not all federal laws are constitutional. They're not, it's kind of crazy, but to think about it, but the federal government can actually pass any law it wants. It has no constitution. There is no constitution for the District of Columbia. So in the District of Columbia, the president can have it as his executive orders. The Congress can pass whatever laws they want to. But those laws do not have any effect inside the several states unless they are specific to the enumerated powers given to the federal government in relation to those several states. And so this verifies it. The Constitution, this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, in pursuance of the Constitution, and all treaties made which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. So that's the premise. That's where the Supreme Court rulings, that's where they get their power. If you took the Supremacy Clause out of the Constitution, you would have no reason to follow the federal government or anything the federal government does. It would have no power over the states. The Supremacy Clause is literally the only verbiage that gives them power over the several states. And so claiming the First Amendment and the Fifth Amendment doesn't have, the states don't have access or don't have to abide by that, is the same thing as saying the 14th Amendment has no power. The 13th that freed the slaves has no power. The states could have continued to do whatever they want because none of these things apply to the states. So it's a ridiculous argument. And so that's where we start. And now the next thing is, and this is something the judge in my case made a couple statements that were like mind boggling. The first thing he told me is, because I brought up, we were actually not even talking about him. We were talking about the people at the city level, or the county. He said that the oath of office, because I brought up the fact that all of these representatives had an oath of office to uphold the Constitution, and he literally said that the oath of office is nothing but a formality. And I mean, that really blew me away that he actually said that on the record. And I haven't gotten a copy of the record, so maybe the girl that's doing it is going to end up leaving that out. But I hope that she gives it to me the way he said it. So the other thing that he said was that we don't have a right to own property. And that pretty much blew me away. And so the first statement here is, do we have the right to own property? And so let's take a look at the Fourth Amendment. It says the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. Well, the first thing, and this is another error that was made a long time ago with the alcohol prohibition, is that the state actually believes, and the federal government, the Supreme Court is the one that actually said this, again, out of complete ignorance, is that the word effects means what we think it means today, which is like your watch and your jewelry and like miscellaneous shit that you have on the floor. But that's not at all true. The word effects in the dictionary back in the day, I actually have an old dictionary, and when you look it up, it actually includes all property, everything. And so property is actually included in the word effects. Now, houses, papers, and or persons, houses, and papers are very specific things of property that they wanted to make sure were pointed out, but the word effects covers everything else. So there's a little bit of proof that we have the right to own property. And so then you get to the Fifth Amendment, and the Fifth Amendment says, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Again, in the core federal constitution, of which all the states have to abide by, we have evidence here that we do indeed have a right to own property. And to prove it, if you go to 42 U.S.C. 1982, I believe it's 1982, they actually get into the right for the slaves to own property. And they say they have the right to own property just as the white people. And so they contradict themselves in all these rulings, but the Constitution itself is where we should be going. We should not start with a Supreme Court ruling. We should start with the Constitution itself, because a lot of these Supreme Court rulings are completely stupid and they need to be overturned. But we're not going to get them overturned by asking them. We're going to have to sue over this stuff. And so what's another example that that the county cannot tax our personal property? And here is a Supreme Court case. This is from 1943, and it says a state may not impose a charge for the enjoyment of a right granted by the federal Constitution. Well, we've already proven that the federal Constitution gives us a right to own property, and this is the Supreme Court going farther and saying that the county can't charge a tax for a right. And so think about this, just logically. If the county has the ability to tax a right, then they have the ability to remove that right. All they have to do is continue to raise the rates until you can no longer afford to pay that particular fee, and they've taken the right away. And so it's logical that the county cannot tax a right, because otherwise it would make no sense. All right. And so that's a very simple way, and there's other stuff that you can get into. If you go through my court case, which I have online, it gets into even more detail. But then where does that leave us with the Georgia Constitution? Well, the Georgia Constitution has this to say. It says, except as otherwise provided in subparagraph B, C, D, E, and F of this paragraph, all taxation shall be uniform upon the same class of subjects within the territorial limits of the authority levying the tax. Okay, so a uniform tax is the same tax. It's the same value for every single person for whatever it is that they're paying the tax on. All right, and then it goes on to say each of the following types of property may be classified as a separate class of property for ad valorem property tax purposes. Now, I want to point out a couple things. Number one, ad valorem does not mean yearly taxation. It means that you're taxing based on the value of something. What is it currently worth? And you come up with that in a certain way. But before we get to that, let's take a look at the exceptions to the uniform clause. So keep in mind, anything not in B, C, D, E, and F are to be taxed uniform. One, trailers, which again, I have problems with some of the things they have in here. Mobile homes heavy duty equipment, motor vehicles owned by non-residents, motor vehicles. And now here's where we get to our real estate. Tangible real property, which is devoted to bona fide agriculture. Tangible real property, which is listed in the National Register for Historical Places. Bona fide conservation use property, and it also goes on agriculture and timberland, and then forest conservation property. Those are the only things listed in the Georgia Constitution as far as what is taxable in this ad valorem category. Okay, so the first thing is that by any county in the state of Georgia that is taxing personal private property is violating the Georgia Constitution. Right off the bat, they're violating the Georgia Constitution. But let's dive into how they're taxing the things that are actually in this list. Are they actually doing that properly? And I also want to point out that all of these property types that are down here happen to be related to commerce. You're actually making money off of this property, and in that case, maybe they can tax the commerce part of it, not tax the physical property, but tax the value of the money that you're actually making off of the property. I'm not really going to dig into that because I'm primarily in my court case, I'm arguing from the private property perspective, and this other stuff you can get into in separate cases. Now, in the OCGA, which is the codification for Georgia, there is 4851, which is the intent of all of this property tax stuff. And it says to have all property and subjects of taxation returned at the value which would be realized from the cash sale. Now, the first problem that you have with that is a Fourth Amendment violation. That is the state requiring you to give up your personal papers so that they can use it against you. They're going to tax you on your personal papers. So that is a violation, a clear violation of your Fourth Amendment rights. But there's nothing that, like, they don't come after me if I don't do this. So it says this, but I'm kind of the position that I don't really care that this is in there because I'm not giving them my personal papers and they can't do anything about it. And they don't try to do anything about it. They just then turn around and make up numbers. All right. So the next section, 4856, says return of property at fair market value. All property shall be returned for taxation at its fair market value. Now, I've done another video on definitions. I'm not going to get into, great depth of this. But here's the gist of it. When the government gives you a definition, you must use that definition. So if they actually spent the time to write a definition in the code, that is the definition that you must use to read whatever it is that you're trying to read. And so this says fair market value. It says taxation at its fair market value. And in this case, they did indeed give us a definition for fair market value. And in this, it says 4852.3 fair market value is an arm's length bona fide sale. Well, I have no idea what in the hell that means. It's a weird thing to say. But it says an arm's length bona fide sale. And what do you know? They actually give us the definition for arm's length bona fide sale. It's in 4852.1. And it says a transaction which has occurred. In other words, it's not some made up number that they come up with to say that this, if you sold your property, this is what you're going to get for it. It's not that. It is a value that has occurred already, a transaction that has already occurred. And if we go back to 4852.3, a little bit farther down in the paragraph, it says the transaction amount of the most recent arm's length sale or recent arm's length bona fide sale in any year shall be the maximum allowed fair market value for the next taxable year. Well, that seems pretty clear. If you're going to use the bona fide sale, which has happened in the past because they gave you the arm's length bona fide sale, then this says whatever the most recent one was, that's the maximum amount that you can charge taxes in the future. So, and that's it. I'm not going to, dig into this in any more detail because I feel like at that particular point, I have pretty much proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that you do not have to pay taxes on your private property, at least in the state of Georgia. And again, I would argue that you do not have to pay taxes on your private property in any state, because I would bet that their codification and their constitutions are going to be written in a similar manner, because charging a tax on private property is unconstitutional. I mean, we kind of proved that in the very beginning. You can't charge a tax on a right, and we do indeed have a right to own property. So the point in this video, and I'm gonna end here. The point in this video is we do have a right to own property, and the county does not have a right to tax it. Even if you were to conclude that they do have the right to tax your property, then it must be done in the way that the codes say, the law says that they're supposed to be doing it. And while the law does have a section in there to tell them that they can, look at neighboring properties and all this other stuff to come up with a number, it is not, you can't just infer that means literally everything. The Constitution is clear. Why did they give you an enumerated list? And by the way, the Constitution for the state of Georgia doesn't say, here's a part of a list, but the legislators will make up a new list. It doesn't say that at all. In fact, I don't think I've seen code in the actual code where they give you a list. I think this is the only list that they actually provide. In the code, they're just assuming that everything's taxable. But there's Supreme Court cases that have also ruled that just because something says it's taxable doesn't mean it hits everything. It only taxes the specific things that are, within the boundaries of that particular tax, or within the like, for example, if Alabama has a tax, I don't pay it because I'm in Georgia. So just because it says they tax all people, it doesn't mean that they literally tax all people. They can only tax the things that are within their jurisdiction. And private property is not within the county's private jurisdiction. And there's a lot more to this, when they come file a lien and then try to take your property. And by the way, one of the things that I did, and it was kind of risky, but I wanted to do it, is I quit paying my property tax. And the reason that I quit paying it is I wanted to see exactly every single step that the county went through to get my property. And it's quite shocking. They literally file what's called a FIFA lien against your property. And with that FIFA lien, they literally just take your property. It's not, I get no day in court. In fact, they tell me that in order for me to go to court, this is another due process violation, in order for me to go to court, I got to pay the tax first. And the funny thing is I pushed this all the way up to the day before they were going to sell my property on the courthouse steps, and I paid the property tax. When I went to court last week, the very first thing that they said was that that I didn't have the ability to take this to court because I had paid the property tax. So the whole thing is ridiculous, and we really need to start fighting all this stuff.